Hello, National University Academy and National University Virtual High School students. Mr. Goyette with your AP U.S. History Unit 6. This is the continuation of the Unit 6 lecture, Part 2. Want to go over the content for that, continue our discussion of World War II. So we talked about Roosevelt's policies toward Latin America, the Good Neighbor policy earlier, and now we're continuing our discussion of U.S. involvement in World War II. Just want to go over a few things, though, just some general ideas to get your mind going here. Quick facts about war costs. The U.S. debt in 1940, to give you an idea of what the debt was before the United States started the war, was about $9 billion. The U.S. debt in 1945 was $98 billion. The war cost $330 billion, about 10 times the cost of World War I, and as much as all of the previous federal spending since 1776. Let me read that again. The war cost about $330 billion, about 10 times the cost of World War I, and as much as all previous federal spending since 1776. So when we talk about spending concerns and tax and spend, Washington, our taxes at this time were significant. To give you an idea, when you're in a war, we don't seem to want to pay for our wars anymore, but I can give you an idea of what this was costing the nation at the time, if I can find that section here. Here it is. As a result of wartime economic explosion, there was a growing affluence despite the federal incentives to businesses, heavy excess profit taxes, and a 94% tax rate. 94% tax rate for the very rich kept the wealthy from benefiting unduly. A huge increase in federal spending and a $9 billion to $98 billion, or $9 billion in 1940 to $98 billion in 1944 spread through American society. A government agreement with labor unions in 1943 held wage rates to a 15% increase, but the long hours of overtime resulted in doubling, sometimes tripling, the weekly paychecks of factory workers. Farmers shared in the new prosperity as their incomes quadrupled between 1940 and 1945. For the first time in the 20th century, the lowest fifth of wage earners increased their share of the national income in relation to the more affluent. Their income rose by 68% between 1941 and 1945, compared to a 20% increase for the well-to-do. Most important, this rising income ensured post-war prosperities. Workers and farmers saved their money, channeling much of it into government war bonds, waiting for the day when they could buy the cars and home appliances that they had done without during the long years of depression and war. I'll just give you a little idea of World War II and its cost. Let's continue with our lecture topics, though. The effect of the attack on Pearl Harbor really woke up the United States. It shocked Americans into an awareness of the Axis threat. You'll remember that there was pressure before that when we talked about Manchuria and Japan going into China. There was economic pressure as there were some acts passed to stop selling petrol and scrap metal to Japan, because the United States had the open door policy at the time with Japan and was selling gas and scrap metal to Japan. Well, FDR decided, okay, well, you're going to go into China. We don't want you doing that. You're going to side with the Axis. We don't want you doing that either. When the Japanese signed the Tripartite Pact with Germany and Italy, that's going to again send a signal to the U.S. to stop trading with the Japanese. And then Hideki Tojo, he becomes the leader, and he's a much more militaristic leader in Japan, and that's another thing that's going to lead to Pearl Harbor. That's going to lead up to Pearl Harbor. So the signs were there, and of course we had already cracked the code. We knew that when we decided not to sell supplies to the Japanese, we picked up signals that they were ready to go to war with us. We didn't know where and when, and that's when, bam, Pearl Harbor hit. The demanded gap with the United States had demanded a withdrawal from China, and Japan saw that as the United States sticking its head in where it didn't belong. And that's when Tojo is said to have told his advisors, this means war. We're going to war with the U.S. And then Pearl Harbor, December 7th, 1941, Ford Island. At the meeting of the Western Allies at Casablanca, it was decided that they would fight the Axis powers until they achieved an unconditional surrender. This is on page 792. After the post-war relationship, U.S. and Soviet Union, the division of spheres of influence of China was not discussed, but the things that were discussed: post-war economic aid, control of the atomic weapons, division of Europe, were all on the table there. Containment policy originated not with Truman coming up with it, but with George Marshall, who was then Secretary of State. Dean Acheson and George Kennan were all selected by Truman to start the discussion on containment. What is containment? Keeping Russia, the Soviet Union, and communism within its borders, and keeping it from spreading, a la the domino effect, into Southeast Asia and other parts of the world. So the State Department leaders and experts were George Marshall, Dean Acheson, and George Kennan. They came up with the idea of containment policy, which led to the Truman Doctrine. And the Truman Doctrine speech, what Truman hoped to do, and this is what his advisors told him to do, was scare the hell out of the Americans so they would support the policy of containment. Now, I know I just said H-E double hockey sticks, and I apologize if I've offended you, but those were literally the words that they used to tell Truman what to do. They told him to scare the hell out of the American people with his speech, and he tried to do that. The Marshall Plan was to finance the economic recovery of Europe, and they spent about $17 billion in assistance over 4 years. It was to finance the economic recovery of Europe, the Marshall Plan, page 814. How did the United States assure Western Europeans that it would honor the NATO commitment? Well, after the war, as NATO alliances were being drawn up, the United States decided, you know what, we'll station our troops in your countries as an extra assurance, as an extra protection against any sort of invasion, and that's on page 815. How did Truman respond to the Soviet blockade of Berlin? With the Berlin airlift, by airlifting supplies into the city. As he bluffed, Truman also sent B-29 bombers capable of delivering atomic bombs, about 60 of them, about 60 B-29s. He sent G-47s and C-47s and C-54s to send food, fuel, and supplies into Berlin. It's on page 816. The goal of the Truman administration was the National Security Act of 1947 was to unify the military services and coordinate diplomatically with military strategy, or diplomatic and military strategy. That's on page 817. The most significant result of the Korean War, Dean Acheson was pushing NSC 68, and he'd allowed him to push that through. The Korean War enabled the implementation of that, and it was a massive rearmament by the United States, page 821. Please review that. Joseph McCarthy drew up a disproportionate backing from the working class Irish, Polish, and Italian Catholics. McCarthy was a known drunkard. He drank on the job often. He attacked General George Marshall, Secretary General George Marshall. He attacked Army Chief of Staff. He called fellow Republicans, said they had no brains or guts. He attacked Dean Acheson, calling him the Red Dean. Like, even people that were securing and keeping America safe were, according to him, were communists. He was just a delusional guy. Even Nancy Reagan, before she was Nancy Reagan, and made it up on one of his lists, and Reagan had to call. That's how they met. Reagan actually called Nancy Reagan, who was not Nancy Reagan at the time, and said, "Are you really a communist?" She's like, "Oh no." So you could tell that this Red Scare that McCarthy had drawn up was really an alarmist situation, and it's unfortunate he was such a drunk nincompoop that he had to go so far with it. We're going to pause there. I'm going to come back to you with more review, just a few more questions to discuss, and to wrap up this review of Unit 6.